afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar. My name is Taeyong Jung. For those who do not know me, I am the Events and Project Coordinator at FCO. Today's webinar will be on medical assistance in dying, and this event is co-hosted by Family Councils Ontario and Dying with Dignity. This is the third and final event we are collaborating on for this series. If you have attended the other events, or if this is your first time, we would like to thank you for being present and joining us on this series of important conversations. Before we start, I would like to take a moment to recognize the land on which we are gathered today. We are meeting on the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. We also acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit. We wanted to share a few logistics and housekeeping rules before we turn things over to our speakers. First, you'll notice that all participants are in listen-only mode. We have reserved time today at the end for an interactive question and answer period. At that time, we invite you to use the Q&A box to ask your questions to our guest speakers. I also invite you to ask your questions throughout the presentation, and we'll address them at the end. And you can use the chat feature if you have any technical issues or technical question. So to clarify that, the Q&A box is questions regarding the presentation, and the chat feature is questions or concerns regarding technical elements with Zoom. For your information, today's session will be recorded and made available to participants and those who are not able to attend on Family Council Ontario's websites and YouTube channel. Our communications manager is currently on leave, but the recordings for all three events, so the past two events and this one, will be posted when they are back. And if you have registered, you will get an email from me once they are online. So now it's my pleasure to introduce you to our speakers for today's webinar. We have Nora Oha-Janians and Rose Doktorov to our webinar today. Nora is a retired teacher, an interpreter, and a blogger. Nora thinks our society needs to more actively engage in discussions about end of life and wishes to contribute to Dying with Dignity's effort to raise awareness about advanced care plans and medical assistance in dying. Next, we have Dr. Rosalind Doktorov, who has over 40 years of experience in education. She currently works part-time as an adjunct professor for Nova Southeastern University. Rose believes strongly in people having a choice about decisions related to their end-of-life journeys and the mission of Dying with Dignity Canada. In addition to being a resource person for advanced care plans and medical assistance in dying seminars, Rose co-chairs the education committee of the GTA chapter. So now I will pass the mic to Nora for a presentation.
Thank you, Taeyong. I will take a minute to share my screen here. Okay. So the information included in today's session of medical assistance in dying is timely and accurate as of today, March 13, 2024. If you're watching a recorded version of this presentation at a future date, be aware that changes in legislation or regulations might affect the accuracy of the content. In our culture, we seldom talk about death. It seems like the topic of death is a taboo. But as they say, there are two certainties in life, death and taxes. Today, we won't be talking about death. We won't be talking about taxes. We will be talking about death, though. My name is Nora Oha-Janians. And I want to give you a little bit of an idea of why I am here sitting today talking to you about medical assistance in dying. I have watched three people I loved very dearly in life suffer and die. One of them was my mom, who had Alzheimer's for the last 17 years of her life. Once she started to lose her faculties, she didn't want to live. She asked me repeatedly to help her die. But I couldn't. MAID wasn't legal then, and even if it was, she wouldn't have qualified. It was very heartbreaking for me. When my day comes, if that's the kind of death I'm going to face, I would like to have a choice. If living looks scarier than dying, then I'd like to have help to put an end to my suffering. The objectives of today's talk are pretty simple. If we have the knowledge of the options available to us, we can make informed choices in our planning and decision-making, and ultimately have more control over our end-of-life situation. What are we going to cover? We're going to talk about who we are at Dying with Dignity Canada. What is medical assistance in dying? How did it become legal in Canada? And what are the eligibility criteria? What the changes are to the original legislation, so what's new in medical assistance in dying legislation, and what can we expect? What are the anticipated changes to be made? At the end of my presentation, my associate, Roz Doctorow, who is a subject matter expert on this topic, will answer your questions. So who are we at Dying with Dignity Canada? We are a human rights charity with over 2,500 members. We started in Ontario and grew to be a national organization. In 2020, we celebrated the our 40th anniversary, advocating for the right to choose how and when we die. What do? We defend human rights by advocating for assisted dying rules that respect the Canadian Constitution and the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. We get no government funding. We are funded by average Canadians who believe there's a better way to die. A recent Ipsos Reid poll showed that 85% of Canadians support MAID for those that meet the eligibility criteria. Our focus is fourfold. In terms of eligibility, we ensure that assisted dying legislation complies with the Canadian Constitution and the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. In terms of access, we work to ensure that Canadians can access MAID according to Canadian Constitution and Charter of Rights and Freedoms. We support people, their families, caregivers, and healthcare providers as they explore end-of-life options, including MAID. And we lead education initiatives, such as the one we're doing today, for healthcare professionals and the public on patients' rights, end-of-life options, including MAID, and advanced care planning. How do we do this? We support and intervene in court challenges that relate to Bill C-14, the federal legislation that allows for MAID. We work to ensure that clinicians who object to MAID are obliged to provide effective referrals for those seeking MAID. And we provide information, emotional, and personal support resources to those interested in MAID. Let us define MAID. Here are the legal definitions. I'll give you a minute to read them. So MAID is either the administration of a substance by physician or nurse practitioner that causes death at the request of the person, or prescription and providing the substance that causes death to the person for self-administration, again, at the request of the person. In any case, it's at the request of the person. Here are 3 women whose courage paved the way to make MAID legal in Canada. The picture on the left is Sue Rodriguez. In 1993, she was 42 years old and suffering from Lou Gehrig's disease, or ALS. She wanted MAID, and she took her case all the way to the Supreme Court of Canada and asked them the question, if I cannot give consent for my own death, whose body is this? Who owns my life? The Supreme Court of Canada upheld the Criminal Code decision provision in a 5-against-4 decision. In other words, it remained a crime to assist someone in dying. In 1994, with the assistance of an anonymous doctor, Sue Rodriguez took her own life by ingesting a liquid mixture of morphine and secobarbital. Fast forward 20 years. We meet 2 other women who were important in the fight to make MAID legal in Canada. The picture on the right is Gloria Taylor, who was suffering from ALS. She joined Kay Carter, the picture in the center, who was suffering from degenerative spinal stenosis, to change history. Both women fought vigorously in court on behalf of all Canadians to die with dignity. Unfortunately, none of them lived long enough to see the result of their fight. Kay Carter got her assisted death in 2010 in Switzerland, the only country that allows this option for non-residents. And Gloria Taylor died of a severe infection in 2012. On February 6, 2015, the Supreme Court of Canada's decision in Carter versus Canada was released. The Supreme Court of Canada determined unanimously that the prohibition on assisted dying infringes on individuals' Section 7 rights to life, liberty, and security of the person. So before it was 5-4 against MAID, and now it was unanimous decision for MAID. The resulting MAID legislation, Bill C-14, was put into law in June of 2016. From June 2016 to the end of 2020, 21,589 Canadians accessed an assisted death to release them from their pain and suffering. Let us look at MAID in more detail. Whoops. Something happened here. Sorry. There we go. Who is eligible for MAID in Canada? The decision to pursue MAID is not taken lightly, and certain eligibility criteria must be met. The person must be eligible for publicly funded health in Canada, OHIP in Ontario. They have to be 18 years old and mentally competent, meaning they have to have the capability to make their own healthcare decisions. They have to have a grievous and irremediable medical condition. More on that in a couple of minutes. The request for MAID must be voluntary. The people who assess the person must make sure that no signs of coercion or pressure are present. And the person must be aware of all medical options available to them so they are informed in making their decision to pursue MAID and ultimately give their final consent. What is grievous and irremediable condition? It means that you have to have a serious illness, disease, or disability that cannot be cured. That this illness, disease, or disability must be in an advanced state of decline that cannot be reversed. That you have to be experiencing unbearable physical or mental suffering from this disease, illness, or disability that cannot be relieved under conditions that are acceptable to you. And that the person's natural death must be reasonably foreseeable. Now that is in red because there were changes that occurred in passing of Bill C-7 that affected that criterion. Now as a result of passing Bill C-7, people whose deaths are not reasonably foreseeable can still seek MAID. Let's see what was the problem with, let's introduce you to two people who were instrumental in affecting this legislative change. Two Quebecers, Jean Trouchon, who suffered from cerebral palsy, and Nicole Gladue, who suffered from post-polio syndrome, in 2019 took their case to the Supreme Court of Quebec to challenge Bill C-14 regarding the eligibility criterion reasonably foreseeable death in order to access MAID. The Quebec court ruled that the need for a reasonably foreseeable death was unconstitutional. The federal government agreed, and as a result, drafted Bill C-7, which was a further amendment to the Canadian Criminal Code and broadened the eligibility criteria for MAID. In March of 2021, Bill C-7 received royal assent and became law. Bill C-7 now allowed people whose death was not reasonably foreseeable to request and seek approval for MAID. This created a two-tier system for seeking MAID. Let's talk about what was the problem with this criterion. First, it was a very ambiguous term. It became difficult for clinicians to interpret it. Second, it excluded chronically ill Canadians with enduring pain and intolerable suffering whose death was not reasonably foreseeable from seeking MAID. And third, it created inconsistencies around access to MAID depending on which clinician assessed you and how they interpreted the term when determining your eligibility. And that is one of the things that Bill C-7 changed. Those whose death is not reasonably foreseeable now have an access, a pathway to receiving MAID. So I mentioned that this created a two-track system, and safeguards now are based on the two tracks. Here is a table that tries to summarize the two tracks of people seeking MAID. In terms of the written request, when the person makes a written request, they have to be informed of all the care options available to them to relieve their suffering, including palliative care, if their death is reasonably foreseeable. If death is not reasonably foreseeable, then the person must be informed of available and appropriate means to relieve their suffering, including counseling services, mental health and disability support services, community services, and palliative care, and must be offered consultations with professionals who provide those services. And they and their medical practitioners must all agree that alternative means to relieve suffering have been considered. So those are important safeguards. In terms of medical assistance, assessors, if death is reasonably foreseeable, any two medical professionals, doctors or nurse practitioners, can do the assessment for the person. But if the person's death is not reasonably foreseeable, one of the medical assessors has to have expertise in the condition that's causing the unbearable suffering. For example, in Nicole Gladue's case, it must have been someone with expertise in post-polio syndrome. Again, an important safeguard. If death is reasonably foreseeable, after the two independent assessors have determined that the person is eligible, there is no waiting period for MAID procedure to be planned. But if death is not reasonably foreseeable, the person has to wait for 90 days from the date of their first assessment. So there's a waiting period, reflection period for a person whose death is not reasonably foreseeable. And for final consent, if death is reasonably foreseeable, the final consent may be waived. More on that a bit later. If death is not reasonably foreseeable, the final consent must be given. Now let's look at how the medical assistance in dying process rolls out. It starts with an initial inquiry. When a person asks their doctor or nurse practitioner about their end-of-life options, they have to get an answer which includes treatment options, palliative care, and MAID. The answer to that question has to include MAID. What happens if your doctor does not support medical assistance in dying due to their own personal beliefs? In Ontario, objecting providers must make an effective referral to an available and accessible physician or agency that is willing to facilitate a request for assisted dying. What's next? If the person wants to take the next step is a written request. No one else can ever request MAID or give consent to MAID on your behalf. It must come from you. So the next step is a written request. In Ontario, the most common one is Clinician 8A form, which establishes your eligibility to proceed with the process, that you're capable of making your own healthcare decisions, that you are aware of your medical conditions, and you have been informed of all treatment options, including palliative care. The signing of your request has to be witnessed by an independent witness who has to meet special eligibility criteria. If the person requesting MAID is unable to sign and date the request, an authorized third person can do so on their behalf. This third person has to meet the same eligibility criteria as the independent witness does. Making a written request for MAID does not mean that you have to go any further with it. This is all about making informed choice. If you want to go further in the process, the next step is the assessment. A doctor or a nurse practitioner meets with the person to determine that their condition meets the grievous and irremediable criterion, and if they are competent in their decision-making. This may include more than one meeting, more than one clinician, and a full review of the medical records. Then a second independent assessor, doctor or nurse practitioner, has to go through the same process. If two assessors independently agree that all criteria have been met, a MAID procedure can then be planned for a person whose death is reasonably foreseeable. If death is not reasonably foreseeable, then there is a 90-day reflection period. For people whose death is not reasonably foreseeable, the assessment process requires an expert assessor in the person's condition. So a third assessment might be needed. Once the procedure is scheduled, the MAID provider issues a prescription and picks up the drugs that are needed on the day MAID is to be provided or self-administered. Prior to administering the drugs, the person receiving MAID is asked to give a final consent for the procedure to the provider. This can be a verbal consent or a physical gesture indicating assent. Or the person can decline the procedure. People do that, and that's perfectly okay. If consent is given or has been waived, then drugs are administered for a quiet, peaceful death that is not painful at all. It takes about 10 minutes. Death is pronounced. Certificate of death is issued. If anyone is interested in personal stories of experiences about MAID, they can go to Dying with Dignity website and read the blogs there. There are some very heartfelt stories there. Now, let me introduce you to another woman who was instrumental in bringing about legislative change. This is Audrey Parker, a Halifax woman. In 2018, she was suffering from stage 4 breast cancer that had metastasized to her brain. Audrey wanted MAID, but wanted one more Christmas with her family before she got MAID, but was afraid that if she waited until Christmas, she might not be mentally competent to give final consent. So she chose to die earlier than she wanted to. She chose to have MAID in November instead of after Christmas. Audrey realized there was a big flaw in the legislation, so did others, and Bill C-7 now contains Audrey's amendment in the form of the waiver of final consent. If that was the case when she was alive, Audrey could have signed a waiver of final consent and spent one last Christmas with her family. Let's look at what's up ahead. The Government of Canada appointed a special joint committee to study some key issues around MAID. There was an expert panel on MAID to study the eligibility for persons with mental illness as their sole underlying condition. The expert panel recommended that Canada move forward with that idea. However, the government was non-committal and passed a bill to push it out for another 3 years. So people with mental illness as their sole underlying condition are still excluded from eligibility for MAID until 2027. The Special Joint Committee recommended that the government amend the criminal code to allow advance requests for MAID with or without a serious and incurable medical condition at the time of the request. What is an advanced request? It involves a competent person making a written request for MAID that could be honored later after they lose capacity to make medical decisions for themselves. For example, if this passes, as an example, I can make an advance request that if I have Alzheimer's and I lose capacity to care for myself, feed myself, or I can't recognize anyone around me, then I want medical assistance in dying, and that would be honored. The Special Joint Committee also recommended that the government amend the eligibility criteria to allow mature minors who have the necessary decision-making abilities to apply for MAID. For example, some mature young people, 16 or 17 years of age, who are experiencing intolerable pain and suffering, and who really understand the impact of what they are asking for, would be eligible to apply for MAID. The Special Joint Committee also recommended that the government increase the funding for palliative care. Let me summarize the key issues of this presentation. The key takeaway points are medical assistance in dying is a legal end-of-life option for eligible people all across Canada. It is a violation of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms to prohibit or interfere with an eligible person's access to medical assistance in dying. It's important to know all end-of-life options in making your end-of-life choice and thereby having control over your end-of-life scenario. No one else but you can request MAID or give final consent to MAID procedure on your behalf. A request for MAID can be withdrawn at any time and never be acted upon. Every story has a beginning, a middle, and an end. The more we participate in writing the ending of our story, the more satisfied we are with the arc of our life. MAID allows for planning, being in the place you want, and having the people and things you want to be surrounded by at the end of your life is very reassuring and comforting to both the person and their family and friends. MAID has been described by both those present and providers as being comforting and peaceful. Here's Irina with her firsthand account of her experience with MAID.
My parents moved into a retirement home shortly after Dad's 90th birthday. They adjusted, but over the course of the next 2 years, Dad was in and out of the hospital 11 times. Nonetheless, it was my mom who died first, peacefully during her morning nap. We worried about Dad, but he was a strong, independent man, and he rallied. He soon started going down to his meals each and every single day. He went outside to talk to friends and to the gym every single afternoon to work out. We thought he was going to be fine. And then COVID struck. Suddenly he was relegated to his room. We couldn't come to visit. He was isolated. But he got through the winter, and summer was promising. We could take him outside, go for picnics in the park, to my sister's for a barbecue. And then fall came along, and the second wave of COVID struck, and again, he was relegated to his room. And this time it was worse because his health was failing. His hemoglobin dropped really low, and he was admitted to hospital for 5 days. It was an awful experience for him being abandoned there. And when he came out, he begged us never, never to send him to the hospital again. Nonetheless, his health continued to deteriorate. His body was swelling. His kidneys and his heart were failing. And so discussions about end of life started. I was looking after palliative care, but my sister started to research medical assistance in dying, which was my dad's far preferred option. She found information online, spoke to knowledgeable people, we signed all the forms, and found witnesses among friends. I distinctly remember my dad speaking to the MAID doctor and saying, "I've lived my life. Now I want to join my wife." And so the day came. We lit candles. We had a guitar strumming in the background. And we brought in photographs of deceased relatives and my mom. All of those that had passed on and were waiting for Dad on the other side. We asked him to tell his World War II story one more time. And we told him how much we loved him. He'd been a wonderful husband, a good father, and a great grandfather. We loved him. He was our hero. A strong, independent man that always been in control of his life. And now in control of his death.
At Dying with Dignity Canada, we believe everyone has a right to a good death. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Nora.
Thank you.
I'm going to take the questions, and there are two questions in the Q&A, and both really have to do with the issue of advance requests and MAID when you have dementia or Alzheimer's. As Nora indicated, there was a special joint committee to consider the issue of advance requests, and they did make a recommendation that the government allow someone who is healthy, who doesn't have Alzheimer's or dementia, to be able to request that if there were a time in their life when they did have Alzheimer's or a form of dementia, that they be allowed to have MAID. That this would be something that the government would accept. But at this point, the government has not accepted this. So even though a large proportion of people in Canada see this as something that they would like to do and like to have, to be able to request in advance that if it's the case in the future that they have dementia, that they be allowed to access MAID. At this point, it's not, in fact, a law that has been passed. So what's happening right now is that Dying with Dignity Canada is lobbying the government to include advance requests as one of the options for MAID, that this become that it become legal and part of the MAID legislation. But as of now, that's not happening. However, I know that some of you attended the advanced care planning event, and there was a discussion about making sure you have an advanced care plan. Some of us in our advanced care plan and in our power of attorney for health have included that we would like to have MAID in the future if we have dementia and we living with certain kind of conditions of dementia, that we would request MAID if it were to become legal. So it's not kind of legally binding at this point, but it is there as kind of a placeholder so that if and when this legislation is passed, those of us who've included this in our ACPs and our powers of attorney will then be able to say, okay, it's part of my plan and it's already in there. We can modify it, whatever, but right now it's not legal. There is another question. It says, is it possible to have a power of attorney request made on someone's behalf? Okay, I'm not exactly sure what you're asking. You make your own power of attorney, and you would have a substitute decision maker who would then, if you aren't able to see that power of attorney through, because, for instance, if you have an illness that doesn't allow you to make those kinds of decisions when the time comes. For instance, if you have a do not resuscitate in your power of attorney for health, and you are at a point in your life where you can't actually tell the doctors that you want this, you have identified somebody as your substitute decision maker, and that person on your behalf will speak for you and ensure that your power of attorney, your request, is followed through by the medical team looking after you at that time. So I hope that answers that question. Yes, this next question is really interesting because I did hear the morning show on CBC, actually. CTV morning news show had MAID-related discussion with a law professor from U of T who raised concerns about doctor shopping after one physician turned down an individual's request and the individual sought out another doctor. The father disagreed with the daughter's decision. She was in her 20s with autism. So this is very complicated. I suggest you also listen to The Current, because Matt Galloway had another medical expert who believes that the father has no right to dispute the decisions of the two doctors who agreed that this woman in her 20s with autism was of sound mind and had the capacity to make the decision that she wanted made, and they agreed that she should have made. Yes, at one point, there was one doctor who said no, and there was another doctor who said yes. But as an individual, she had the right to, I wouldn't call it doctor shopping, but to get another opinion. And what the person on CBC who was commenting stated was that if we allow, for instance, the courts to get involved in decisions around our healthcare, when we have the capacity to make those decisions, it opens the door to many other kinds of issues that would affect our independence around making healthcare decisions that we believe and for ourselves are the best decisions. What this woman said was that people with autism are generally very capable of making decisions for themselves. And it's not a kind of disease where you don't have the mental capacity to decide that this is something that you've decided with the support of these doctors and a witness, you want for yourself. So it's a very interesting case. I think we all should follow it to see where it goes, because it does have implications beyond the MAID implication. So thank you for raising that. I was going to raise that myself just because it is something that's current. And, there are many, there are organizations that do not support MAID. There are organizations that would rather MAID not happen. Dying with Dignity Canada is here to ensure that Canadians who choose to have MAID have the right to have MAID and are able to receive MAID as part of their legal rights as a Canadian citizen. I see something in the chat. Right. Are there any other questions for me? Let me just say that there has been a lot of recent news about the passing the law related to having MAID when mental illness is the sole underlying cause of illness, and it was to be passed this month. And now, as Nora said, it's on hold for the next 3 years. There's a lot of discussion around, whether or not people who are mentally ill have the capacity to make that decision for themselves that they would like to have made. There's a lot of discussion around people with mental illness being equally as ill as somebody with an incurable, irremediable disease. They suffer tremendously, and whether or not this meets the requirements of our justice system to make a distinction between somebody with a mental illness and somebody with a physical illness, who are both suffering terribly and are choosing and would like to choose to end that suffering. So again, this is something else that has been in the news and will continue to be in the news for the next few years as, again, it comes forward as potential legislation for MAID. Anything else? Okay, if you think of something, I'm here.
I think we just got one question
Okay.
in the Q&A box.
up. There it is. Anything individuals? Yes. The question is there anything individuals can do to help advocate for the MAID updates? You should go to the MAID website, the Dying with Dignity website, Dying with Dignity Canada, and there is an advocacy page there. You can lobby your member of parliament. There were petitions. I think the petitions are closed now, but they may open again. Writing letters to the editor in support of these changes to the legislation, all of those things. And then, we're expecting an election in the next year, probably, maybe I don't know, this year. So raising this as an election issue, I'm sure others will be raising it and getting involved to help to make these changes. Again, because we may have a different party in power. There may be attempts to roll back some of the legislation that we have. And so we need to be on top of it, and we need to be aware of what happens before, during, and after the next election.
Great. If there's no other questions, Nora and Roz, would you like to kind of give closing remarks for your presentation? Any final words?
Thank you for the opportunity. I think this is an important topic, and I think that we should talk more about it in our society, the way with our medical care system and everything. It's an important topic. So the more we talk about it, the more we spread the word that this is there and available and safe. There are many safeguards. The better we will be off at the end of our lives.
As a baby boomer who was, involved in many different organizations over the years, to, baby boomers try to be in charge and be in control of their lives. And I think that this issue is, again, we as baby boomers are the ones who are in line for thinking about MAID. And so I would urge you all to talk about end of life, to make sure you have your advanced care plan in place, to make sure you have power of attorney for your health and for finances, and to make sure you identify a substitute decision maker who will follow your wishes. Make sure that person has the strength to argue against anybody who wants to change your wishes, because that person will be your spokesperson if you can't speak for yourself. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Nora and Ross, for this wonderful presentation and for your knowledge. And another thank you to Dying with Dignity Canada for the series of events. We had a really great turnout, and it's amazing that we were able to bring this important conversation, this discussion to our audience. Just to remind everybody that this webinar has been recorded, and the link to the webinar will be sent to you once it is uploaded. We hope to see you at our next events that Family Council Ontario is organizing. We do have 2 French events that are coming up in the next 2 weeks. It's Francophone month right now, so we are collaborating with the Réseau Francophone des Conseils des Familles Ontario, and it's going to be next Tuesday and the Tuesday after that. So if you would like to attend, it's going to be in French. All the information is on our site. And yeah, if you have any questions or concerns, or if you have questions for Roz and Nora, you can write to me directly, and then I will transfer it to them. And yes, thank you everyone for being present and interactive today. Take care and have a great day. Thank you,
Thank
everyone.
you.
Goodbye.
Bye.